continuing our sermon series for the summer called Get Wise as we look at the book of Proverbs. And typically when I'm preparing a sermon, as I thought about this a lot in our Matthew series, is I usually sit down and I prepare a sermon that will best pastor you all, because that is what I get to do in my role. But this morning, the topic that we're going to be covering, it's a bit personal to me. And the reason why it's personal to me is because it's something that I've actually, for some reason or another, struggled with for quite some time. And so, though I will aim at pastoring you, I just want to share it's going to be from a personal perspective as well. And in order for me to give you a clearer picture of what that struggle is, I need to talk to you about Steven Spielberg's 1991 classic Hook, starring Dustin Hoffman and Robin Williams. For those of you who aren't aware, Hook is a creative take on the classic tale of Peter Pan. And in Hook, the basic premise is that Peter Pan, at some point in his life when he was younger, he leaves Neverland, he grew up, he got married, he had kids, and he became an important figure in his company. And when he did that, in time, he lost his childlike nature. He lost a little bit of his passion for life. He stopped playing the games that he used to play, and his wonder had faded. Peter Pan had now become Peter Banning, who was older and grumpier and impatient and less fun, and he lacked wonder. Not to mention completely forgetting that he was ever Peter Pan. And at one point, early in the film, Captain Hook takes Peter's kids. And Peter Banning, while talking with Wendy Darling, who used to go on those adventures with him when they were children, they were trying to figure out what to do in this scenario. And Wendy, who is much, much older at this point, tries to remind Peter of who he is. She says to him, Peter, in order to save your kids, you must make yourself remember. And Peter Banning replies by asking, remember what? And Wendy says to him, Peter, don't you know who you are? He had forgotten who he once was. That person, that childlike nature who is filled with wonder. And as I reflect on my relationship with God, faithfully following Jesus Christ for almost 19 years, I find myself at this point in my life, much like Peter, a little older now, and I find myself asking myself the question, Joel, don't you remember who you are? Don't you know who you are? And the reason why I ask that question is because I remember what it was like for me to follow the Lord in those early years of my life. I remember when I would open up Scripture for the very first time, everything was coming to life for me. The words were jumping off of the page into my soul. I remember, every single Christian book that was placed in front of me, I would read it cover to cover. I'd soak up all of the information. I was so curious, and I was just lost in this beauty of who God was. I remember in those early years that I would go through, and I feel like every day I was just floating through life with the joy of being in Christ and being in awe of who He is, amazed at the person of God. But over time, for some reason that I can't even begin to comprehend, I feel like I've lost that wonder. Now my passion and my love for Jesus are still there, but I feel like I've lost that childlike wonder. And by wonder, what I mean is that maybe that ability to be surprised by God or be in awe of Him with regularity. That unbroken focus on the small details that God is weaving and working into my life to see new things that God is doing each and every day. Instead, I feel like over time, I've become a lot like Peter Banning, forgetting who I was. Probably because I'm distracted by all of the things in life that are going on around me that I can miss the wonder of God even in my life and even as a pastor. And by the way, I'm convinced it's not just me. I think it's other Christians too. We can lose our wonder. I mean, think about our Sunday services. When we come in here, when we gather together as sons and daughters of the living God, do we come in expecting something new, or do we expect the same old, same old? I know it's pretty much the same template most weeks, but do we come in with any expectation of wonder that God is going to do something new in us? Show us something new we hadn't seen before, and amaze us in such a way that we are surprised by when we leave here. And I think sometimes with that loss of wonder, and I know this is true of me, it can make us feel as though we are distant from God. Maybe some of you feel like that here this morning. And I'm convinced that it's not just Christians. Doesn't it feel like our world is beginning to lose a sense of wonder? We don't enjoy living in the moment anymore. Especially, if you see these videos of people going to concerts, like every single phone is out because we have found that it's more important for us to show others that we were there rather than just being there in the moment. To be lost in the wonder of what's happening in front of us. One of my favorite quotes is from Paul Hawken, and he said, Ralph Waldo Emerson once asked what we would do if the stars only came out once every 1,000 years. No one would sleep that night, of course. The world would become religious overnight. We would be ecstatic, delirious, made rapturous by the glory of God. Instead, the stars come out every night, and we watch television. The wonder has faded in time. And yet, as we look at the Proverbs this morning, it will give us hope that there is wonder in God still to be found. Now, there's no formula of which we can conjure up that wonder, but I hope that these verses will give us a clue of how to find it. And my bottom line for us this morning is this, is let wisdom in the wonder of God lead us to worship. Let wisdom in the wonder of God lead us to worship. That in order for us to rediscover that wonder, we need to see that there is wisdom in keeping our eyes out for and our hearts open to what God is doing around us with a regular basis. And my hope is that will lead us to worship. And let me just tell you, my brothers and sisters, that I'm not just preaching this to you this morning. I am preaching this sermon to myself first. And so if you have your Bibles, you can open now to Proverbs chapter 30. And if you need a Bible, raise your hand nice and high, and our ushers will get one to you. And we're going to be looking at Proverbs 30, just actually 5 verses from this particular Proverbs. And in Proverbs 30, we are going to meet a person whom you've likely never heard of before in the Bible, someone named Agur. And Agur is the kind of person that when we read what he has to say, we can't help but say, I like Agur. I want to be more like him. The way he carries himself, his attitude, his perspective, his wonder. And this is, you ever see or meet somebody that has like compassion and kindness and goodness and a way about them? You're like, man, I really want that. That's how we're going to feel whenever we read Agur here this morning. Because we're going to see what he has to say about wisdom in the wonder of God. And so we're going to start with the first part, verse 1, as an introduction. It says, the sayings of Agur, son of Jakeh, an inspired utterance. This man's utterance to Ethiel. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Agur. The commentators sort of think that he's possibly a non-Israelite Yahweh follower, similar to Job. But we're about to, from these verses, get a little bit more insight into his character. He tells us that he's giving this inspired utterance, or another word for that is oracle, and that he's giving it to someone named Ethiel. Likely a disciple of his. And so if he's discipling this person, what he's doing is he is passing on a perspective of something that he has learned in the realm of wisdom, much like in the spirit of Solomon throughout the rest of the book of Proverbs. So what's his opening line? His opening line is, I am weary, God, but I can prevail. Surely I am a brute. I am only a brute, not a man. I do not have human understanding. Boy, that's quite an introduction here. So what's he saying? First of all, he's saying something that I think we can all relate to. I am weary, God. I am weary. Life is tiring. Responsibilities pile up. Information keeps coming in and it's difficult to keep up with. Things are happening in our lives all around us. Chaos can overwhelm. But he is hopeful as he says, I can prevail. Now, it's not the point of our sermon here this morning, but I think there's a good prayer to be found in that God, I am weary, but with you, I can prevail. And then he begins to give Ethiel an important perspective. He says, I am only a brute, not a man. I do not have human understanding. I actually like the ESV's translation of this, which says, surely I am too stupid to be a man. And some of you in here are saying, you're giving a little too much credit to men, all right? So what's Agur doing? He's giving us a perspective that we all need to keep in mind, that when I think I know something, I don't know anything. His attitude is that he's placing himself in this low position. He is not acting like a person who knows it all. Because sometimes those people act in such a way where they're trying to give you information to make you feel small, to put themselves above you. But there are those, and I think Agur is very similar to this, there are those types of people who have a lot of information, who know a lot of things, but they only share what they know when the timing is right. And the reason why we like those kinds of people is because of their humility. You see, pride, as C.S. Lewis says, puts ourselves above things, and we look down on them. And experiencing wonder never comes from being above things, but only below them and beneath them, to look up at them in awe. And if you can't have wonder, how are you supposed to worship God? But look at what Agur says next here. He says in verse 3, I have not learned wisdom, nor have I attained to the knowledge of the Holy One. Now, I can't help but point out the irony that the guy who is saying, I have not learned wisdom, is currently writing a revelation from God in the book of Proverbs that's focused solely on biblical wisdom. Nonetheless, I think we can appreciate his attitude. And I love what he says here is, nor have I attained to the knowledge of the Holy One. Now, the Hebrew word here for knowledge is the word da'ath. Da'ath. And it's different than the word yada, the word for knowledge that Adam talked about a couple of weeks ago. Yada speaks more about that deep personal knowledge that you have in a relationship with somebody. What he's talking about here is this general knowledge of how we can know who God is overall, the normal way of which we think about knowledge and our accumulation of it. So the basic idea of knowing stuff. You know, when it comes to knowledge about God, I bet some of you can kind of relate to what Agur's saying here. You know, some of you, feel like sometimes you can barely find the table of contents in the Bible, let alone John 3:16. And some of you feel so inferior to the sense where you feel unconfident and you think to yourself, I don't know anything about God. But let me just say this, which is part of Agur's point. I don't care if you have a PhD or an HGTV in theology. Okay? You and I will never attain to the full knowledge of God. You hearing me? That there is no limit in the knowledge of God that we can learn. And as I was thinking through this and I was processing this, and I was like, is there a way I can give an example to this? And the Lord gave to me the idea of technology. Think about technology. That there's always, no matter how far we've come in human history, there's always more to find. Think about all the things that we've just discovered in the last 150 years. I want you to try to explain to a cowboy in the wild, wild west that one day they can listen to music by Taylor Swift on a bullet-sized device that fits in your ear, where the music travels through the air from a battery-operated handheld device that's not attached to any cables, which is made possible by invisible radio waves called Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Try explaining that to them. And the number one question from that statement is going to be, who is Taylor Swift? But here's the point. If on this rock called Earth, floating in the middle of endless space, there's always more for us to find here, how much more the God who made it? How much more the God who made it? Because sometimes you hear people say, when we get to heaven, we'll better understand God and his plans. I mean, maybe not. Do you understand that the Bible tells us there are secret things to God that we will never know? Almost as if when we get to heaven, we will only see the tip of the iceberg of our knowledge of God. And if that's so, that means that what he has revealed to us at this point in human history may only be the single ice crystal on the top of that iceberg. Do you see why wisdom and the wonder of God lead us to worship? But we must maintain that humility, or we must maintain that perspective in order to maintain that humility. I remember God humbled me a couple of years ago. Before I went into seminary, I had thought to myself, I've read quite a few books about God. I've listened to thousands of sermons. Remember, I'm here twice a Sunday, everybody, okay? I've read a lot of the Bible. I've studied a lot of it. And I remember when I came out the other side of that first semester, I was like, man, I know nothing about God. I don't know nothing about him. And I think that there are times that I still find myself going, and maybe you can relate to this, like, yeah, I know this. But if I start believing that I know everything about God, then I will learn nothing about him. Why? Because as Alan Jacobs says, those who could never be fooled will never be delighted. Those who can never be fooled can never be delighted. That those who refuse to learn, refuse wonder because they refuse to ever be surprised. And what Agur is trying to teach us here through his attitude and perspective is that we must maintain that we cannot attain to the full knowledge of God in order to keep that wonder alive, because there will always be more for us to learn. We're going to skip down here to verse 18 and read verses 18 and 19 here to kind of unpack this a little bit further. He says, there are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 that I do not understand. And that idea of the 3-4 is a Hebrew poetic device that is used throughout, especially even in the Psalms. And what we see here is he's using words like amazed and I do not understand, and sometimes that word amazing can also be translated wonderful. That Agur is continuing with this humble attitude. And one thing that I picked up on as I read all of Proverbs 30 is that Agur is not a cynic. Which, by the way, is very hard for us not to be these days. We are constantly walking around with a deep distrust of people's beliefs and motives. And we're constantly asking ourselves the question when we see things that are in front of us of what is true. And let me just tell you, the internet has not helped in the slightest with this. It has not helped at all, especially with the rise of AI. It's very difficult for us not to be cynics these days. And Paul Miller, in his great book on prayer, called The Praying Life, he says this. He says, cynicism begins with the wry assurance that everyone has an angle. Behind every silver lining is a cloud. The cynic is always observing, critiquing, but never engaged, loving, and hoping. What he's saying here is that cynicism is destructive to wonder. It's destructive to wonder. And what Agur is doing here is he won't let cynicism destroy his wonder. Because if you read in Proverbs 30, my man is engaged, he is loving, and he is hoping. There's further clues in verse 19 of how we can recapture that wonder. So first he says, there are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 that I do not understand. Then he says, the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a young woman. I want to point out a couple of things here. The first is, I love how he's enraptured with mostly simple things. These are the kinds of things that we can look at with regularity and not think twice about. Oh, look, an eagle through the air. A snake moving on a rock, a ship on the sea, a relationship between a man and a woman. And sometimes what we find ourselves doing is we get caught up in sort of complex things. We're more fascinated by a Lamborghini engine or a star in the distant galaxy or a Rolex watch or a computer circuit board. Why? Because those things are a little bit more intricate and they require more, and so they draw more of our interest, but not for Agur. He focuses on the simple things. The second is that his wonder comes as he reflects upon how those simple things work. He keeps using that word, the way. How does it work? How does it operate? It slightly reminds me of a scene from a Big Bang Theory where Sheldon, who is a theoretical physicist, is talking to Penny, who is an aspiring actress who is also working as a waitress, and they're talking about string theory. And in string theory, it's very complex. And so as Sheldon's trying to talk to Penny about string theory, Penny is distracted by trying to figure out how do they put the stuffed crust in a stuffed crust pizza. Agur is Penny here. Agur is Penny here. He's caught up in the simple things. He's, how does the air move beneath an eagle's wings in such a way that allows it to fly? How does a snake with smooth skin move so easily across rough surface like rocks? How does this giant vessel as a ship rest so easily upon the waters and maintain its buoyancy, especially in the high seas? How does a relationship between a man and a woman work? Now, let me pause for a second. Because the staff had a hard time with this one on Wednesday. And I said to them, that's because you are all reading that verse, at least that phrase, with your Western eyes. You're reading it in such a way that your understanding is that you think this is like a 60-year-old man with a 13-year-old girl. And then when we read something like that, we go, ew, gross, right? That's how we react to that. But you have to read this with Eastern eyes. This is why it's important to know Bible stuff, folks. Because you have to understand that in the ancient Near East, it was very common for men to be considered men from the ages of 15, 18, and up. And so for that word there, man, it could be as young as, think about in Jewish culture. When are they considered a man? 13. When they become 13 years old, they're considered a man. And so that word there for young woman, it's the same word. It's like a maiden or a virgin. It's to talk about a young woman. That's the same word it was used to describe Mary. And it was very common for men to be a little bit older in that time. So this isn't as creepy as you think it is. But the whole point that it's trying to get at is how do a relationship between a man and a woman ultimately work? It's a great question. Last weekend, my wife and I went away to celebrate our 17th wedding anniversary. It was quite wonderful. And so that evening when we were out at dinner and I was looking at her from across the table and I saw her and her beauty and her wonderful hair and her beautiful smile, and I just couldn't help but reflect and wonder, how did such a beautiful woman like her land a guy like me? I don't know why you're laughing. Trust me, I do. If you know my wife, your laugh was justified. And so, but the point is like, how does all this work? And I love that Agur's getting lost in the details of how these simple things work. And lastly, I love that his focus is on creation and relationships. And the reason why this is profound is because these are the things that are around us every single day. Which means that they provide endless opportunities for us to engage in the wonder of them, which points us to the wonder of God. And as I was studying this, and I was getting more and more like lost in what Agur's attitudes and perspectives were, I couldn't help but notice, and maybe you noticed it too, he has a little bit of this childlike nature to him. This childlike wonder. Did you pick up on that? Paul Miller says that the cure for cynicism is to become like a little child again. Why? Because children are full of wonder. They are innocent. They long to be delighted. They ask 1,000 questions why about a banana. Right? Their imaginations are so full. The kids who are showing up for VBS this week, they're going to think that this is a real log cabin. And they're satisfied with that. And they're going to get lost in that. And it's wonderful that their minds long to learn. They're like these little sponges. This is why Jesus says, unless you become like little children, you'll never enter into the kingdom of heaven. That we must have their attitude, their hunger to learn, their wonder of the simplicity. And what happens is when we grow up, adults can become these know-it-alls. And Agur in the Bible tells us that though we grow up, though we get older, we must keep that childlike wonder because it goes with us into eternity. Let me just tell you this right now. That right now in heaven, there is no cynicism there. None. There's none to be found. It's just person after person for whom Christ died for and brought into his kingdom by his very grace, that are walking around, breathing in each moment, going, wow. Wow. Can you believe this? Do you see that? Do you see what God has done? That is why we must become like little children. Because you see, the Bible, much like in Neverland, doesn't want us to grow up. In fact, I want to make the case that God wants us to be what I call mature children. We're supposed to be mature children, that in the process of us becoming more like Christ, we mature and grow, but not at the cost of our childlike faith. What do I mean by that? I'll just give you two examples from Agur here. You see, immature children, when they look at creation, when they look at this big and beautiful thing outside of themselves, they can say, isn't this so cool? God is so neat. Right? They make this observation of this thing that they absolutely declare is wonderful. But a mature child of God can look at creation, understand its beauty, but also have read in Scripture that despite the beauty of a waterfall at sunset, God says in His Word that you all in this room and every human on this planet is the most precious thing in all of His creation. That we are all the apple of His eye. That we are all the most valuable thing in this universe that He created. And that can lead us to worship. Or if you think about an immature child thinking about a relationship with God, I don't know if you've met a lot of young kids. Most of the kids that I've met, they think they're pretty awesome. They're pretty confident in themselves. And when they hear the gospel, the fact that Jesus loved them, that He died for them, they can say, well, that was so nice of Him. Isn't Jesus such a nice dude? But here's the deal. Listen to me very carefully. A mature child of God who, as they grow up, recognizes more and more of their fallenness, of their brokenness, of their sinfulness, when they hear the gospel. The fact that a God who's so holy and other, and us who are so not, that He loved us so much that He sent His one and only Son to die in our place for our sin. That leads us to go, oh my gosh, you died for me? Why did you do that? I'm not worthy. Jesus says, I know. That's why it's called grace. That the older we get and the more that we recognize, the more that we engage in worship. There are those of you this morning in this room that are in your 60s and your 70s and your 80s, and you are worshiping stronger than those of us who are in our 20s and 30s because you know more of your sin now more than we do. Which means that you also know more of the grace that God has extended to you, and you worship. This is what it means to be a mature child. This is what it means for us to seek wisdom and the wonder of God. To disengage from the distractions. To yearn, to want to learn more about Him. To walk slow through His creation. Don't run, to take it in. To not just be so fixated on the complex big things, but to take note of the small things that have intricacies to them God created. To reflect on the fact that God created relationships and He wants to have one with us. That's amazing. And this is those things that I just mentioned are what I've been trying to aim at in my own life a little bit more. To be able to see the wonder of God. You see, it's not just the point is not just to point to the wonder of God, but the fact that God Himself is wonderful. That this is the wisdom and the wonder of God that Agur wants us to understand. And as I begin to close, I want to leave you with this. Maybe you're someone who, like me, has struggled at times to see the wonder of God. Maybe you're somebody here, maybe visiting here this morning with a family member who's maybe walked away from God over the years or stepped away from things of the faith. And yet you hope that childlike faith is still in there. Let me encourage you with this. There's a turning point scene in Hook where Peter Banning returns back to the Lost Boys and they all reject him because they do not believe that he's Peter Pan. And it's this moment where they leave him in the courtyard and Rufio draws a line in the sand And all the lost boys step on the side of Rufio, everybody leaving Peter by himself. There is a moment where one lost boy named Pockets goes up to Peter, and he's curious. He's curious. And he goes, and he looks into him, his eyes. He looks upon his face. He pushes back his cheeks. And he's looking for something. Eventually, he proclaims, "Oh, there you are, Peter." That wonder is still in there. That childlike nature was still in there. And the point of that's why that's a turning point in that movie, is because from there on, that wonder begins to grow in Peter Pan. And eventually he remembers that he was Peter Pan. And so my prayer for you all is that as you continue to pursue faithfully going after God and you get near to him, that he will look upon your face, that he'll look deep in your eyes, and he'll push back your cheeks, and he'll say, "Oh, there you are, Bill. There you are, Linda. There you are, Jean. There you are, Paul." That wonder's still in there. And through the gospel of Jesus Christ, that wonder can grow. Because that's my prayer for myself as well. That as I get closer and closer to my God, he will remind me, "Oh, Joel, you're still in there." And that childlike wonder can grow. Let wisdom and the wonder of God lead us to worship.